Are we ready to roll, darling? All right, we're ready to roll. Well, thank you so much for coming. It looks like probably almost everybody that came before came again. That's probably a good sign. Might have even picked up an extra body or two out here, which I love to see. I do appreciate it. It means a lot. It's just hundreds of hours of time that goes into these things. Because for every, 3 things I present, there's 30 things I choose not to because I think it's a weird detail, or it's too much, or it's too deep, or it's not worth talking about, or whatever. So it means a lot, and I really do appreciate it. Makes it all worth it. So we are going to start off in prayer. Obviously, all this is only available because God's made it available. He's put a lot of really smart people who know a lot more than any of us about any of this stuff to work in recording it down so that people like us can read it and share it around. And that's really what it's all about. God has revealed himself in many ways, and people smart enough to notice it have recorded it for us. And that's what we're here to explore tonight. So let's start in prayer, and then we'll get going. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the opportunity tonight to just present you the way that you do reveal yourself through nature, through science, Lord. You are apparent if only we were looking for you. And so we pray tonight that we'll see you in ways we didn't before, that we'll understand things better than we did before, that our faith will be strengthened more than it was before, that our testimony will be strengthened to others, and that you would just enable us and equip us in every way for your purpose. And we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Now, last time, I had one little fact, and I wanted to make sure I was clear about it because I could not find it. I've got my iPad up here with me tonight, so if I get one of those, I can Control F that dude and find what I'm looking for that I can't find. But I talked about DNA, which Dirk pointed out, like, we probably need a good explanation about DNA. And I was like, well, that's coming. We'll talk about DNA probably next time anyway. But just suffice it to say, DNA is obviously the code that you're essentially made of. Your cells read that DNA code and use that as instructions to build whatever it is they need to build, whether that's eyeballs or liver cells or hair or whatever it may be. And all living things have DNA in them, whether it's a fruit bat, fruit itself, grass, people, monkeys, chicken hawks, they all have DNA in them. They're all made of DNA. And I'd said something about base pairs and how it would just be ridiculous to think that life could spontaneously generate. The simplest cell that cannot even function itself, that would need a lot of outside help, has 500,000 DNA base pairs, which would be the equivalent, I said, of shaking a box of English letters and dumping them out, and The Hobbit arranging itself without a single transcription error, which is ridiculous. Obviously, that doesn't work. And I said, I can't remember, apples and people have a bunch of DNA. Apple has 800 million base pairs of DNA, and a human being has 3 billion base pairs of DNA. So just, it's sufficiently complex. One other thing I did not mention last week that I wanted to mention, and it just slipped my mind, and now it slipped my mind again as I started to say it. Oh, I know what it was. If DNA really evolved, this was something I had not thought about before, and I caught it in a podcast, and I was like, yeah. If DNA evolved, it's a code, right? So my dad, when he was when he started working at the plant, the milk plant that he retired from, there was a point where they started teaching him code, and they taught him BASIC. And BASIC is a very simple code structure. Nobody uses BASIC anymore. Engineers in the room are nodding their heads like, yeah, we don't use BASIC anymore. BASIC is really simple, but you can see little snippets of it appearing in other places. But we might code in Python or something today. DNA is the same in every living thing. There are no differences in there's not an early version of the code. It's not like sea slime has some different version, like DNA 1.0, and we're on like DNA 17.4 or something like that. It doesn't work like that. All living things function with the exact same code, which just gives you more evidence that it is not, in fact, an evolved thing. It's just what God made right from the start. So getting started tonight, because I've probably got I plan to have more than I can cover. That's what I'm going for, so that I have to stop at some point and just pick it up next time. To get started, because we're going to be talking about the flood, I want to just read from Genesis to you so that you know the flood that we're talking about. I tried to clip out the best part that had everything in it I wanted without giving you a bunch of extra stuff you didn't need. So we're in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, and we're going to read all the way through into chapter 8. So here's what it says. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month. It's very specific. I like to point that out. The Bible is incredibly specific about what day this falls on because it wants us to know this isn't a metaphor. It's literal. It's a literal span of time. And we can know exactly when it was. On that day, all of the fountains of the great deep burst forth. It notes that first, which is going to be significant tonight. And the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now, when it says the windows of the heavens were opened, we can take that. It's like, oh, it's a metaphor. That means it rained. Yes, it is a metaphor. And yes, it does mean that it rained. But it also is speaking, the cool thing about the Bible is it is accurate in the day it was written. To the people to whom it was written, it is accurate today, and it will be accurate 10,000 years from now if God keeps the earth here that long. When the Hebrew people read that, what they took that to mean, they thought, you hear sometimes in the Bible, it talks about like the pillars of the earth and the 4 pillars of the corners of the earth and the sky and a bow above and all this kind of stuff. So to them, they thought of the earth as like a plate almost, sitting over a volume of water, and there were columns holding the earth up out of that water. So they would think if you dug down a ways, there'd be water under there, which they're not wrong about. There is water down there. Not quite the way they're thinking of it, but that's the way it worked. And then way out somewhere on the 4 corners were the pillars that hold the sky up, and the sky is kind of an arc above us, and beyond that sky was water. Because when you look out at the ocean, it's blue. And when you look up at the sky, it's blue. And sometimes water falls from the sky. I mean, really, it just makes sense, right? That there's water up there. So when they say the windows of the heavens were open, they literally are thinking of it like God goes, and like cranks them open and rain falls down. And then he cranks them closed. So to them, that made sense. And to us, we understand it kind of metaphorically. But it's the same concept. So rain falls, 40 days and 40 nights. And on the very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. They and every beast according to its kind, and all the livestock according to their kinds, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and every bird and every according to its kind, every winged creature. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. Significant that God shuts the door, because I think if Noah had shut it, he'd been tempted to open it again, because as you're going to find out tonight, it is probably way into the flood before people start dying, which means people were probably begging to get in for a long time before that. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. Waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. Cubit is the distance from your elbow to the end of your finger. It's about 18 inches. Oh, let me see where my spot was there. And don't tell me verse now, Dirk, because I copied this onto my paper and now it won't help me. Yeah, I got it. Thank you. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals, and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. And they probably continued to rise significantly after the raining stopped. We'll talk about that tonight. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. And the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, and rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And again, specifically, in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, in the 10th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So we know exactly how long they were in there, and it's getting on to almost a year that they spent on that ark between the time they got in till the time that the waters had abated and they were able to actually get off and get out. So what we want to look at tonight here, first off, what do we know? So we know what the Bible says, and we believe that to be true. But again, if we want to just wipe our slate clean and not even try to use the Bible right now, if we just want to look at the evidence and we're not going to think too much about what some geologist says the layers of the earth are, let's just look at it and let's just try to figure it out. What do we know? Here's what we know. There are layers of rock. Those rocks contain fossils, and it's all fairly distributed evenly across the entire planet. Those layers of rock are so consistent that we can find a layer on one continent, and you can pretty well bet you're going to find that layer on another continent, and the kinds of fossils you will find in it will be about the same no matter where you look. Now, some places are more likely to have dinosaurs in them than others because dinosaurs lived in certain places and not others. But the point is, those lowest layers, you're going to find those same low layers somewhere else, and no matter where you find them, you're only going to find very simple marine fossils in those low layers. And as you go up, you're going to find a little bit more complex marine fossils, bigger critters. And then you go up and you're going to start finding small animals and mammals and, small mammals and stuff like that. And then you're going to go up and you're going to find the real big critters and so on. And that's fairly consistent throughout the world. Here's what we don't know. We don't know how long it takes any one of those layers to form, and we don't know how much time elapsed between the formation of the layers. We really don't know that. Now, there's all kinds of guesswork on that. We have our own idea about how long those things take, and secular scientists have their own ideas about how long it takes to form those layers. Now, you might say, can you just date the layer? Not really. And we're going to talk about why with the dating methods, a whole bunch of stuff about that. But for one really simple reason, even why a secular scientist won't take a sample out of one of those rock layers and say, here's how old we think that layer is because, and this is fitting for a flood, they are all sedimentary rock, which means they settled out of water. And they literally settled out of water. So for a long time, secular science has said, well, what happened was this is stuff has blown up and mounded up and then slowly compressed into rock, or more than likely at one time, some of this was underwater and some stuff settled down and it gradually settled, and over millions of years that settled into a layer and then But that can't be. And we actually know now that absolutely cannot be. This is one of those really cool science things. In the last 20 years, scientists have done some studies, and what they found is, without boring you to death with a bunch of details, I can reference you a book you can read if you want to be bored with all the details, or really interested in all the details. Certain patterns in rock, certain crystal formations that happen in rock, certain ways that the rock lays down, it can only do if it comes from water, and that water has to be moving more than a few centimeters per second. There's a certain speed it has to be laid down on. All of these layers of sedimentary rock that we're seeing are interspersed with layers that can only be laid down in moving water. So this whole old school thought that, water must have been here for a long time and all this stuff came down and some critter walked into the water and it died and it got down on the bottom and it got slowly buried. None of that stuff makes sense. It's not scientific. It doesn't work. That's not the kind of rock you would get if you were to do that. It's not gonna fit that an animal could die and sink down into that and get preserved that way. Here's something interesting. The Titanic went down a long time ago, and the water is incredibly cold and incredibly deep. So deep that even when we knew where it was, we had to invent things to get down there and even look at it because it is so stinking deep. Pretty much nothing lives way down there because it's so dark and so cold, not a whole lot can go on down there. There is not a single even fingertip bone from a single human victim in the Titanic. Not one. Where did all the people go? They got eaten by sea critters, bacteria, right? Like all that stuff's gone. Even at that depth, even people who were trapped in some part of the ship and they went all the way down and they were closed behind a bunch of doors, their bodies are gone, long gone, because there's stuff living even that far down in the ocean to not only completely consume a body, but to completely destroy all the bones and everything. Which is really curious that we have millions and millions and millions of things that are buried in rock all over our planet that appear to have gotten there by settling out of water. How did they get there? They got buried. They got buried fast, which we can talk about that a little bit more in a second, because I've got a whole thing about how fossils form. Okay, so we don't know how long it takes these layers to form. We don't know how much time is between them, but we think it's pretty quick based on the things that are in them. And of course, the secular view is a little bit different than that. So the secularists say, as I said a moment ago, well, all of these layers took at least hundreds, often thousands, sometimes millions of years to form. See that layer right there? That represents 200 million years. Okay. Look at this. We can look at that set of stripes, and you and I can look at that and say, wow, that's really cool flood deposit. And a secularist can look at that and say, wow, that's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of years of time. There is a really obvious problem with those being representative of millions and millions of years of time. They're really flat. They're often really thin, and they contain absolutely no indication of erosion, which is curious, considering if that layer were to be laid down and it was supposed to hang around for millions of years for another layer to lay down on top of it, I would expect at the least for those layers to be pretty jaggedy and uneven as the ground is jaggedy and uneven and other layers laying on top of layers. But we often find when we get down there very deep at all that all the layers are really nice and level and straight and clean for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles sometimes. There's one sandstone layer in North America. I can't remember if I put the image of it in the presentation or not, so forgive me if it comes up in a little bit, but it's called the Tapeats sandstone, and it covers practically all of the United States and way up into Canada. It's one layer of sandstone. It's consistent across the entire continent, and it's not very thick. It's interesting that the geologic conditions across all of North America were such that this one giant layer of sand slowly settled out and not a bit of erosion happened while it waited for 50 million years for another layer to form on top of it. It's really curious how that works out like that. So, here's another picture. That's a good one. Now, when we look at that, you can say, wow, that's really cool. I could see how a flood could have laid down some really cool, crazy layers, or maybe it's one of these situations where something gets laid down and it's still wet, and then while it's wet, it kind of like settles and moves, and it slowly kind of twists into this cool shape. And I can see from a flood standpoint how something like that would have formed. Secular science will tell you, well, those rocks bent. Really? That's a fascinating, there's a whole thing. I mean, there's papers written about all the processes needed to get these rocks to bend. It's a whole lot easier to just see them for what they are, which is flood deposits. But whatever, it's all good. So that's the secular view. Our view, the creation view, is of course that these layers are evidence of a global flood. And what is that evidence? Well, golly, that's what the whole night's going to be about. So I'm going to cover a lot of things that are evidence of that flood. And maybe into next time too, very, very possibly, considering I'm already like 20 minutes in. So here's what we know. The Earth's crust is made of sedimentary rock, which it makes sense to be a flood deposit. That sedimentary rock rests on top of granite. And that granite, nobody really knows how that gets here. And then, so we got granite, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. And then we've got sandstone layers, essentially, with all kinds of different levels of critters in them. And occasionally, we have layers of something like shale or something like coal, which are also evidence a bunch of living stuff was there, and it all died and got squished and has become petrochemical resources for us, which probably also didn't take millions of years to form, but that's a whole nother thing. Okay, so what we're going to talk about tonight, what we think is the truth about this flood. It has its problems too. So just like we understand the problems of the secular viewpoint that, I don't know about the erosion thing, kind of seems like a sticking point. The fact that fossils need to be buried really quickly in order to form, and there sure are an awful lot of them, seems to be a problem for them. Ours has its problem too. One of the things that we're going to mention tonight is this concept of mega sequences is a theory, and it's what we're going to talk about tonight because the author of the book that I read was really going to town on this. He's been doing a lot of science on this. He's been drilling a lot of core samples and aligning rocks from all these different continents and saying, this is what I really believe happened. But it is a theory, so, it can't ever be completely proven. We already said, without faith, we're not going to be able to prove God, right? We have to have faith that he exists. We also will find that there are no human fossils. None in the rock layers, which ought to be as much of a problem for secular science as it is for us. So it's not really any one person's problem. Of course, they're going to say, well, people have only been here for, 100 million years. They haven't had time to form into rocks yet. What we know to be the case, obviously, would be that people escaped the flood as long as possible. And so most people probably didn't die until the very, very end of the flood, which means they were near the very, very top layer. And they would have succumbed to all the kinds of things that destroy most creatures that die. I've been a hunter a long time. I go out in the woods a lot. It's pretty rare to even find a shed. People hunt a lot to try to find a deer shed. And you find a shed, that's pretty cool. And I've found an occasional like cow bone or something like that. You just never find a whole skeleton out there. You just don't. Because natural processes just tend to take care of that stuff really, really quickly. And that would have been true for humans. They would have been so late in the game to die that they would have been open to the elements and erosion. And eventually, when creatures repopulated the earth, anything that was still left out on top would have been subject to that. The other issue is, how did the earth get repopulated? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. There's kind of a neat theory about that. But it is a little bit complicated to get people and animals scattered on all the continents around the planet if they all had to come off of one boat, right? But there is a pretty good explanation for how that happened. So I don't think it's too much of a weakness. But I like to point the weaknesses out, such as they are, because somebody will come to you and say, yeah, well, what about this? And you don't want to be like, oh, I didn't really talk about that. Because if you don't talk about it, then it's like, oh, he was hiding something from me. I don't think there's anything to hide. But these are the weaknesses such as they are. I think we can strengthen them all up, but in any case. Okay, so geologic time. If you go in a high school textbook or a middle school textbook or whatever and crack it open, you're going to find these absurd ages of the earth, like, well, this rock layer is 200 million years old, and this rock layer is 1.4796284923724 billion years old. Because the more digits you put after a decimal, the more precise it must be, and you can't be wrong. If you wear a lab coat and carry a clipboard and use enough decimal numbers, you just go without having to worry about being questioned. I think that pretty much, that sounds stupid and we all laugh about it, but it's kind of true. It's like you go to school and all your professors are telling you this stuff and they're supposed to be smart and they have lots of big and little letters after their name and all kinds of commas and stuff. And so they're supposed to know stuff and they're saying it's true, so it's probably true, right? Like, I don't know, I have some questions about it, but it's probably better to just not ask. And I think that's how most people get where they are. But if you see those layers, okay, well, where did that way of measuring geologic time come from? So back in the 17th century, a guy named Archbishop James Ussher calculated the Earth's date. And he did that by taking the Bible, and also he amassed Jewish manuscripts too and genealogies and used all of the relevant data that he could to try to calculate an exact precise day on which creation happened. He believed there would be enough evidence to do that. And he came up with the date October 22nd, 4004 BC, which it's weird to start time on October 22nd, but hey, that's a joke. If it doesn't make sense why that's funny, we'll talk later and we can figure out why that's funny. But obviously the calendar didn't get invented until a lot later. Okay, so we thought that the world was about 6,000 years old for a very, very, very long time because that's what the Bible says, and people just kind of took that for what it was. But then things, we started to question things, and some different ideas came out. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was this theory that kind of took in we call it uniformitarianism, which means everything's uniform. Nothing changes. Nothing ever changes. So whatever we observe now, it's always been that way forever. And we never see any rocks just accumulating, so it must happen really, really slowly. And that means that, probably these things have been here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It would take a lot of time for a rock to form. So probably the earth is really old. And then in 1859, of course, Darwin proposed on the order of species about natural selection and how evolution might have occurred. And what Darwin noticed kind of makes sense. I mean, he's on an island and he sees birds on one side of the island with really short beaks, and he sees birds on the other side of the island with really long beaks, but they're clearly the same kind of bird, like they look the same. But they're so different now that they can't even breed with each other very well. And one of those birds is attuned, its beak fits the depth of the flowers that it feeds out of on this side of the island, and the flowers that have deeper, bodies to them that require a longer beak, the birds just developed that longer beak. He said, you know what? I bet that's what happened. I bet that's how all things got to be here, that everything just slowly changed into something else. And Darwin thought when he came up with that idea, we were just starting to dig fossils up out of the ground and speculate about what these things might have been. And if that seems weird to you, do know this. We never dig like a whole dinosaur up out of the ground. Like that almost never happens. It's very rare. You see it all the time, like on a movie or something, they're like dusting something off and it's like an entire T-Rex. It's like, and you're like, oh, that's really cool. It doesn't hardly like ever happen like that. Most of the dinosaurs that we have like displayed in a museum, if we even have 5% of the bones, it's shocking. A lot of times they have like a chunk of like the top of a skull and 2 teeth and like 3 fingers, but not from the same finger, like 3 bones from like different fingers, and like a piece of a rib and a piece of a rib and something that might be a femur, and I'm sure that was a Shmashkodon or something. Like, just make something up. And it's safe to say, if I've got a rib over here, I could reconstruct the fact that pretty much every creature on earth has a rib over here. Well, they've got another one over here that looks just the same. So that's not a big stretch of the imagination. But you'd be surprised how much stretching our imagination we do to fill out what those skeletons look like. So in Darwin's day, we were just digging up little pieces and we really didn't know what to do with them. And he thought, what's going to happen is over time, as we dig up more and more of these bones, we're going to make more sense of them, and we're going to know what these critters look like, and we're going to understand that, a fish became a lizard, and a lizard became a chicken, and a chicken became a T-Rex or something. I don't really know how it's supposed to work because I don't believe it anyway, but you get the point. He thought we would find all these transition fossils. Spoiler alert, we didn't, and we still haven't, but we'll talk about that more later. Darwin needed lots and lots of time for his theory to work. So the earth just had to get a lot older because it takes a long time for a chicken to become a T-Rex, probably. 20 or 30 million years or something. And if you're like, where did he get the number? 20 million years. He just made it up. And if you had asked him, and this is one of those things man, Darwin's a jerk. He's not a jerk. If you had asked him, where did you come up with that number? He'd be like, I had to make it up. But in time, science will, add a little to it or take a little from it or whatever, because we'll figure it out. But it probably takes a good million years to turn from a chicken into a donkey, and it takes another million years for a donkey to become a Pegasus, and I don't know, I'm just making stuff up. You get it. So there was no dating technique employed. It was just a number that we just made up. And then in 1896, this guy named Henri Becquerel discovered radioactivity. And if you thought, I thought Marie Curie discovered radioactivity. Marie Curie discovered X-rays, and they're way cooler than the radiation that this guy discovered, and that's why she gets all the credit. Plus, she's a lady, and it was high time for ladies to get some credit for something, so I'm cool with it, and I think Henri Becquerel's probably cool with it too. I don't know, I didn't ask him, he's dead. And he has been for a long time. But he said, some things seem to emit invisible radiation. Whoa, 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 And I bet over time, they emit less of it. And that seemed to be the case. And so we thought, if you find a rock that radiates, and you see how much it radiates now, and we measure it for a while, and we find that it radiates less, then logically, I could figure out how old it is by how much it has deradiated. But we didn't have any way to actually do that. It's like a cool idea, but he didn't have a tool. We just discovered radiation. We don't have a way to measure it precisely like that. But he employed that concept, and so we thought, Earth's got to be like billions of years old then, probably. But again, that's just a total guess. And then in the 1930s, we invented the mass spectrometer, which lets us actually do some of that measuring of how much things decay, how much radioactivity they have, and then how much they have later. And there was a proposition that the Earth might be as much as 4 billion years old. And now, I think we've gone backwards on our science, because today, the way we date the age of the Earth is to not look at the Earth at all. They measure radioactivity on parts of the moon, like rocks we brought back from the moon. I'm sure they didn't pick up any radiation bringing them back, right? I wonder about that. I'm sure they know better, but whatever. And meteorites, because they're like, the Earth and the moon and meteors all got created at pretty much the same time. I don't know how they know that, but they know it. They know it so well that they're convinced that however old a meteor is, that must be how old Earth is. And so that's how we're dating it now. And we've arrived at a very precise number. It has 2 decimals, 2 numbers after the decimal point. 4.56 billion years. That's the current going age of the Earth. Now, how would we know that? Where do they get that number? Okay, well, that's where we get into absolute dating. So I'm not going to try to bore you to death with this, but I do want you to kind of basically understand how this works. So there are certain elements in the ground that are radioactive. You've probably heard of like uranium or plutonium or something like that. Uranium is naturally occurring, and it's highly, highly, highly radioactive in its natural state. You just dig a quantity of uranium up out of the ground, it's going to mess with, don't do that. Don't put it in your pocket. People worry about having your cell phone in your pocket. That's nothing. Don't put uranium in your pocket. Uranium is highly radioactive. And so something like that, we can look at how it decays over time, and we can kind of guess how old it might be. So what happens, let's take, do I have it written down for radio? Yeah, I do. So uranium, if I've got a chunk of radium in my hand right here, again, bad idea, but let's just say I do. And we get to looking in it. What we're going to find is there's a certain amount of it that is made of highly radioactive uranium, and there's going to be some of it that has become radium. Radium is a completely different element on the periodic table, but it's what uranium turns into as it decays. So you probably remember from chemistry class, if you remember nothing else, this is pretty basic chemistry class. All atoms are made of protons and electrons, and if they change in number, they change into a different thing, right? Like every element on the periodic table has just exactly one more electron or proton or whatever than the one before it. So that's exactly how it works. When uranium starts throwing electrons off, it becomes radium, essentially. And so if I were to pick up a chunk of rock and I measure how much radium is in it, and how much uranium is in it, and if I think I know how long it takes uranium to turn into radium, I ought to know how old it is. So that's kind of like saying, I have a carton of eggs, and they're going to hatch into chickens. And every day, one egg hatches, and I get one more chicken, and I open the carton up, and I've got 5 trapped, really spooked little chicks who've been stuck in this carton, and the rest are eggs, then I can date how long the carton's been sitting there, right? I mean, that's a stupid illustration that I literally just now made up on the spot, but you get the point, right? It's kind of the same thing. My uranium is hatching into radon. And so that sounds good, but we're making a lot of assumptions. We're assuming that, a carton of eggs I know is complete. I can tell. I know how many eggs are supposed to be in it. And I know if one's missing. That's harder with just like a random chunk of uranium that I dig out of the ground. And also, here's a crazy thing that nobody talks about. Uranium comes from the ground, right? If you've spent much time in the ground, you know it frequently gets wet. Have you noticed this about the ground? It gets wet a lot. Like sometimes it's so wet. Uranium is crazy water soluble. It dissolves in water really, really easily. So if I dug a chunk of uranium out of the ground, how would I know how much uranium it was supposed to have, especially if it had ever in the history of its entire existence ever gotten wet, even a little, which seems really likely, especially if you are the people who are claiming that that rock has been here for 4.56 billion years. You're the one telling me that you can date it, and there's been a lot of water there in the last 4.56 billion years. Like, I think I would have a better time dating it with my 6,000-year-old Earth than you would with your 4 billion-year-old Earth, and yet you're telling me you know how old it is. That seems weird to me. It's also weird that any material I want to date that way. Do you know what is not water soluble? Nothing. In time, everything is water soluble. Everything is water soluble. I mean, have you ever cracked open like a really old like engine case or something, and the oil in it has gone to gel? It's like a jelly. Oil and water don't mix. Oh, but they do eventually. Water gets in and it breaks down and it tears everything up. Water will grind down granite. In time, it just dissolves it off. It's crazy what water can do. So, follow me here. I have my eggs and I have my chicks. But really, they're in like a wildly rushing river. And they're clinging on for life. That's really what's going on. And it doesn't matter what kind of dating I use, because uranium's just one thing we can look at. There's all kinds of different rocks we can look at, and they have different ways of dating different things. It's like, oh, well, this element turns into this element, and this element turns into this element. Lead, interestingly, turns into different lead. But because it's all water soluble, that means I'm banking on being able to date this thing by how many eggs and how many chicks I have. I need to know both. I can't just know the eggs and I can't just know the chicks. I have to have them both because I have to know how many eggs became chicks. But the water can carry off eggs and or chicks, which means both ends of this thing are just full of holes. And nobody's talking about that. Nobody's talking about that. Until I read this book, I'd never once heard anybody talking about water permeability. But it's kind of a big deal. It kind of makes it all completely meaningless, really. Okay, so just so you know, in case you ever run across the term half-life outside of the video game series that's been dead a long time, half-lives are how long it takes for a quantity of uranium to half dissolve into radon. Or for carbon, it turns into nitrogen. So if I have a pound of carbon and a half a pound of it has turned into nitrogen, that's the half-life. If that took 5,000 years, then the half-life of carbon is 5,000 years. In 5,000 years, half of it will turn into the other thing. Does that make sense? Half-lives are not hard to understand. They're exactly what they sound like they are. Now, we don't generate ages of rocks from sedimentary rocks, because sedimentary rocks, the kinds like the whole earth are made of, conveniently, could be made of a random collection of stuff, right? Like, you've seen sand at the beach. That's kind of what sandstone's made of. And that sand is made of all kinds of little bits of rock that just kind of washed off of everything. So that means that sand could be made of bones and quartz and other things. I don't know, whatever it is sand is made of. So if I dated one grain of sand and I dated another grain of sand, I might get wildly different numbers because that one came from this thing and that one came from this thing and they came from different sides of the planet. And so all of the sedimentary rock in Earth is kind of hard to date because any of us would believe, we believe, it's made of a bunch of washed off flood stuff from all over the dadgum planet, and secularists believe it's made of whatever it is that makes up rocks over a course of 4.86 whatever billion years. Point is, that stuff came from all over and you can't date it. Okay, so then how do we date rocks? Well, there's two ways to do it. One is if you know the date of the fossil in the rock. How do we date the fossil? By the rock it's in. And if you think that sounds dumb, I'm not making it up. That is pretty well how it's done. Now, there is a way to kind of help us figure it out. So if we have an igneous layer, which if you remember from high school science class or maybe even grade school science class, igneous means lava. It's cooled from magma. We think we can probably date igneous rocks. So let's say I find a layer of old molten lava that's cooled into an igneous rock, and then a bunch of layers of sandstone, and then another rock, and there's a dinosaur somewhere in between there. I say, oh, well, that igneous rock dates to 500 million years, and this rock dates to 400 million years. Then this dinosaur is 4 to 500 million years old. Okay, that might be true. It's not, because the Earth hasn't been here that long. That's how they get those dates. Now, here's what's crazy about this. You never find this. It never works out. It's incredibly rare that they dig through and they find a perfectly datable igneous layer and then dig down and find a fossil and then dig down and find another igneous layer. It might sound like, oh, that probably happens all the time. It probably does sound like it happens all the time, but it doesn't. What usually happens is we find an igneous rock, and then 35 miles away, we find one dinosaur bone, and then 22 miles away, we find another dinosaur bone, and then 10 feet away, we find a whole bunch of them, and they don't appear to go together, but maybe they do, and we're not sure. And then on the other side of the planet, there's an igneous layer that probably would have been here, except it isn't. And so that's how we decide how old the dinosaur is. That is literally how it works. We take an igneous layer from here, and a dinosaur from over there, and another igneous layer from somewhere, and we calculate a date, because it's the best we can do. Here's what's also really crazy about that. There's really good scientific evidence that the heat of being magma resets the radioactivity clock of the material that the igneous rock is made of, which is not helpful. And if it ever got real hot there, in between the time that it laid down, it could have reset it again. Or at least fiddled with it, which is really, oh, dang. It's like we don't know how old this stuff is. It would be really handy if someone was just there when it all happened and wrote it down. Oh, wait, we do have that. It's called the Bible. That's what we do. We believe that thing. Okay, so that's how that works. Okay, now, I think I've covered all that stuff. So here's a really cool fact. You'll find this interesting. I think it's on my next. Oh, yeah, okay. If you can see this, if you can't, it's cool because I'm going to tell you what it means. I would use my laser, but I never know how to get it on. Yeah, you want to get it on for me? Let's get it on. Oh, babe, let's get my laser on. Let's glow, baby. Okay, thank you. One of these days, I will learn how to work this thing. Wait. I know, well, I can see it. Okay, there it is. That's not helpful at all. Okay, forget that. All right. So, carbon. You're made of carbon. I'm made of carbon. Diamonds are made of carbon. Jesus thinks you're valuable. The end. Good night, folks. No, I'm just kidding. That'll preach. You can save that one for later. No, seriously. So, we are made of carbon. Diamonds are made of carbon. That is true. Because we're carbon-based, we have carbon in our bodies. If we were to die, because carbon naturally occurs at stable isotopes, but also radioactive isotopes, if we were to take you, once dead, and measure your carbon, we could see how much carbon-14 is in you, which is radioactive, and how much nitrogen-14 is in you, which is what radioactive carbon becomes, and we could probably figure out how old or how long you've been dead. Of course, that's assuming we knew how much you had to begin with and that no water got in, but that's a whole nother thing, right? Like, we're not even going to go back there again. Here's the reason why we can do that. So the reason why there's all this radioactive carbon around and you've got some in you is because the air has a bunch of nitrogen in it. In fact, the atmosphere is like 74% nitrogen or 76% nitrogen or something like that. And when the sun hits that nitrogen, it turns some of it into a radioactive form of carbon. And that gets into your lungs. It is also true that the sun, through the process of photosynthesis in plants, the plants generate some of that radioactive carbon. And when you eat plants, it gets in you. And if you are like some folks and you really don't eat a lot of plants, you probably do eat a lot of things that eat a lot of plants, and it'll get in you that way. You're going to get it in you, right? And so that's why there's so much carbon around. Of course, we understand the problems with dating the carbon that's in stuff, but that's why we like to use it. Now, here's what's really cool. Because you might die and a whole bunch of other living critters might die, we could eventually become a coal bed, and we think that maybe those coal beds occasionally produce diamonds. Or, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it kind of works that way. It's all made out of the same stuff. A diamond is supposed to take at least hundreds of millions of years to form, but probably like billions, which is why they're so expensive and rare, and you should pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars for them as a sign of your love or whatever. They're actually not all that rare, but anyway. Diamonds, because of how old they're supposed to be, ought to have, because remember, radioactive carbon, I got the radioactive carbon, I died, I became a diamond over a course of 1 billion years. There really should not be any radioactive carbon left in a diamond. There should not be. Now, there's always a chance that when you go to open something up and measure inside of it, that you accidentally get some other stuff in there. Like there's other stuff trapped in the thing that you're trying to measure, or you introduce it artificially when you cut it open or whatever. What do you know about a property of diamonds that makes them really, really special and unlikely to be contaminated? They're stupid hard. They're the hardest thing on the dadgum planet. So as long as it's a good, clean diamond, it ought to just be made of just diamond. And you really, as long as you're very careful about the lab environment in which you crack that sucker open in, you're not going to get anything but diamond in your sample. Now, we know, of course you know this, the half-life of carbon is like 5,700 years. Of course you knew that. 5,700, 5,000 years. So like Abraham could be diamond now and all of the carbon would be gone, right? Right? Interestingly, they took 20 different samples of diamonds and coal, and they sent them off to labs, and this wasn't done like back in the 60s or something. This was done in, it was after the year 2000. Yeah, in the 2000s. 10 coal samples and 12 diamond samples were sent to secular labs. Every single sample contained measurable amounts of carbon-14, which means they're not that old. And in fact, by their dating, they said, ooh, man, whatever these things are that you had to study, they're less than 100,000 years old. Well, that's interesting, because they're diamonds and coal, and they're supposed to take millions of years to form. That's very interesting. Those samples were taken from all over the planet, and they were taken from every single rock layer, like all those ones you see in the geology textbook, like the Jurassic period and the Cambrian period and the pre-Cambrian. They got diamonds from every single layer they could get diamonds from, and they sent them all to the lab, and every single one of them came back the same. Almost like they were laid down about the same time. And almost like all that dating stuff is just a bunch of hokey garbage because it's all just made up, which is, in fact, the case. This would be fine for us to make all these estimates if we didn't already know how old the earth was, right? Like, if you just have to guess, you just have to guess. But we don't have to guess because we do have a manual that tells us exactly the operating instructions for this world and exactly how old it is. It's about 6,000 years old, and it's the Bible, and we already know that. So there's really no need for us to worry about all that stuff, and we talked about all that. C14 in diamonds, that's a problem. It should not be there. Water is a problem. It gets into everything and it messes all the dating up. Also, fun fact, if you take a random sample and you send it off to a lab and have it date tested with their radium dating, whatever, you'll get a number. And if you send the same sample off again, you'll get a different number. And if you send it off again, you'll get a different number. And if they use a different kind of testing, like instead of testing this particular element, they test a different element, and then a different element, and then a different element, all of those tests will give you back numbers that are at least hundreds of millions of years different, sometimes billions of years different. It's almost like these measurement tools are entirely worthless. We have every bit of scientific evidence to prove to us every single one of these dating techniques is completely worthless. But we keep using them. And we treat it like it's fact, and we put it in your kids' textbooks. And they read it, and they're like, oh, I guess it's 250 million bajillion years old. Okay. Just spin the wheel and pick a number, right? Like, honestly. Or you could just go with what the Bible says. These are not repeatable results. If they're not repeatable, testable results, then they're just not science. They're just a theory. They're just an idea. They're religious, really, if you want to believe in them. If you want to believe it so well that you're willing to fight over it and force other people to try to adopt it, it seems like a religion. It's just a religion without a God. I like my religion with a God a lot better. Okay. Oh, here's another cool thing. Check this out. Oh, yeah, it's coming up. I think I've talked about most of this stuff already. C14 in diamonds. We'll talk about the DNA soft tissue here in just a second. Yeah. Okay. Check this out. That right there is a blood vessel. Looks good, doesn't it? Like, that could have been alive like yesterday. That blood vessel is from a T-Rex femur that was found in the Hell Creek Formation in Wyoming. That particular blood vessel is supposed to be like 60 million years old. But it looks awfully good for 60 million. Like, if I look that good when I'm 60 million years old, I'm going to feel really good about myself. For the longest time, we said, oh, well, there will never, obviously, we're never going to find any soft tissue. When Michael Crichton wrote Jurassic Park, it was such a crazy idea that we would be able to, like, make a dinosaur out of some, like, it had to be blood in a mosquito that was encased in amber, because that amber would completely, like, seal it off from the outside world. Boy, if he'd just waited about 30 years to write that book, he wouldn't have had to go to all that trouble. We find DNA in dinosaur bones all the time. In fact, when they found this one, they thought it was an accident. The gal had taken, so the reason why it took us so long to find soft tissue in dinosaur fossils, it's not because it's rare. It's not rare at all. It's probably in just about every one of the stinking things. The reason why nobody ever found it before is because nobody was bold enough to take a chunk off a dinosaur bone and dissolve it in, like, acids and stuff. Put it in chemical processes. But we've got enough dinosaur bones now that this one lady was like, I'll do it. And so she hacked off a piece of dinosaur bone and stuck it in this solution. And sometime later, one of her lab assistants got it out and was like, oh man, this bone got all spongy and I can't get it to lay down flat. And so she's poking it with a stick trying to get it to lay down flat. And then she's like, oh, wait a minute, the bone's all gone. This is all soft tissue. And I would have shown you the picture of that soft tissue, but it looked like something I blew out of my nose, and I just thought it might not be appropriate for the audience, so I didn't save that one. But there are pictures of it. You can find it out there if you have a, I don't know, weird fetish or something, you want to see that. So, truth told, we find this stuff all the time now. And we find pliable dinosaur skin. which is really a problem if it's 200 million years old, but it's totally not a problem at all if they died in a flood just like 4,000 years ago, which is what we in fact know to be true, and that they've just been sealed away for just a little bit of time, which is what we know to be true. Okay, so check this out. I got some other little facts I want to share with you. Trying to decide which ones I want to cover. Check this out. I'm going to share this with you. I still want to talk about rock dates and how dumb they are. Check this out. A lot of you will be alive to have remembered this. In 1986, Mount St. Helens erupted. You know, I was alive for that. I was 3. So I don't really remember it all that well. But I know some people. They took some rocks 10 years after Mount St. Helens erupted. They took some of the accreted, keep in mind, how do we know how old a dinosaur is? Sedimentary rocks are no good. I need an igneous rock. Okay, so igneous rocks, those are really reliable. Sure. Okay, so we take a rock that we know for a fact is born of Mount St. Helens. Hey, there's no rocks there. Whoa, rocks. I wonder where they came from. They're made of ash and like magma stuff. Oh, I bet it's the dadgum volcano, right? Like nobody's messing up. We know what these are. They take a chunk of this rock and they send it off to a lab and they say, how old is this rock? You want to know how old that rock was? It was not 10 years old. It was somewhere between 34,000 and 2.8 million years old. And when they said, oh man, how are you off so bad? That guy got the wrong rock. I bet he dug too deep is what it is. He dug too deep. He got the wrong rock. Really? I think it was probably pretty easy to figure out. I think he probably wasn't a dumb guy. Lava from the eruption of Huala in Hawaii. There's a lot of unnecessary consonants in Hawaiian words. I don't know what it is. It happened in 1800. It happened in 1800. Those rocks dated 160 to 1.6 million years old. 160,000 to 1.6 million years old. 1792, Mount Etna in Sicily erupted. Those rocks were almost 350,000 years old. That's crazy because it should have just been a couple hundred. In 1915, Mount Lassen in California erupted. Those rocks were 110 to 300,000 years old. And there's more examples. I'm just reading a few. This method doesn't work. Clearly, it doesn't work. So we can't date the sedimentary rocks. We also can't date the igneous rocks. Also water. Also, right, like all this stuff. So this stuff's completely bogus. Now, trying to decide how I want to land this ship today. I kind of want to get, okay, let's do this. Oh, I got another one though. I have to tell you this. The T-Rex fossils that they find. So they love Wyoming. Wyoming's got a bunch of dinosaurs in it. I'll actually tell you why. Oh, this is a cliffhanger because we won't get to talk about all the progression of the flood today, which is fun because I wanted that to happen next time. We have a whole picture of exactly how the earth probably looked before the flood happened. And we have a pretty good picture of how the earth changed as the flood was happening. And like sequence by sequence, we kind of probably know what probably happened. And so there's a really great reason why there's a bunch of dinosaurs in Wyoming, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. You're just going to have to come back. If you're like, dang it, I don't get to come next week. Oh, better cancel your plans, sucker, because this is coming down next week. This is cool. They found a T-Rex, and I don't think it was Sue, the T-Rex that we have the soft tissue from. It might have been. I don't think it was. Here's a curious thing. In the same rocks that they found Sue in, or whoever Sue's T-Rex sister was, they also found, they talk about the T-Rex a lot. Here's what they don't talk about. There were 6 species of shark with the dinosaur, which seem like they come from different environments. I feel like sharks and T-Rexes probably don't play together too much. I guarantee there is a stupid illustration in a museum somewhere that has like a river with a dadgum shark in it and a T-Rex just like eating that shark because that's the only thing that would make sense. I guarantee it. I absolutely guarantee that's a thing. Sharknado is what it was, yeah. Oh, this is probably just Sharknadoes. And the Sharknadoes just deposited sharks and washed up B-movie stars all over, and T-Rexes ate. Obviously, that's where it came from. Yeah, that's exactly it. Pretty much every time. Every time we find dinosaurs, we find marine fossils with them, even if they're not marine dinosaurs. There are places where they find, also, like in Montana and Wyoming and stuff, where we find a lot of dinosaurs and stuff. They find gar, which you probably know are freshwater fish, and paddlefish, which you know are freshwater fish, in the same spot as sturgeon, and in the same spot as manta rays. And the secular explanation for that is, whoa, freshwater manta rays, that's cool. Freshwater sturgeon. I didn't know they did that, because they don't. And they say, well, you know, there are some, a bull shark could be freshwater or saltwater. It's like, yeah, that's true. There's one thing that can do that. Just one. So that's a pretty big leap of logic you took there, Chucko. But, you know, whatever. Okay, I got to tell you this last thing, because this is a great cliffhanger teaser for next time. I feel like I didn't get too far this time. I hope you feel like you learned something. Something decent. Oh, that's not what I want. That's not what I want. That's not what I want. Oh, that's all good stuff. I want to talk about all that stuff. Okay. I have one that just says rocks on it. I swear I do. I can't find it. Okay, doesn't matter. I thought I had a slide that said rocks. This is really simple. Earth is basically made of like different things depending on where you're looking at it. The entire ocean floor is essentially made of basalt. I'm not missaying salt, like it's the salt or basalt. No, it's basalt. That is a material. It's thin crust, and it's made of basalt. The ground you're standing on is layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of sedimentary rock, things that percolate out of moisture. And below us, below all that, is granite. Now, secular science is trying very hard to explain where granite comes from. And they've got an explanation that sounds an awful lot like the explanation for why diamonds and coal are so old. Well, it takes a lot of heat and pressure and time. Cool, we can make diamonds in a lab in like 30 minutes. So, I don't know about that. Anytime they say, well, it takes a lot of heat and pressure and time, you can also just be like, oh, so you're making it up. Okay, cool, that's fine. We've established a neutral ground. I understand. You're making it up. That's cool. Granite probably forms like that. Here's what we know. The ocean floor is all new. It's all new. The reason why it's made of basalt and it's very thin is because it is the magma that is squirting out of the ocean trenches that completely crisscross our planet. We know where all those trenches are, and there's a million reasons that I can talk about later why we absolutely scientifically know that the rock coming out of that crease is far younger. It's like brand new, and the stuff way up at the edge of the continent is just as much older as you would expect it to be if it came out of that crack and just squirted its way up there. So what has happened is the entire ocean floor, it's like it just broke open or something. Almost like maybe there were like fountains of the deep down there or something, and they all just broke up. And then all of the Earth's crust that once was there went somewhere else. It just got right back into the magma and got remelted. I'll explain to you how all that works next time. It's a really cool story. So that means the ground you're standing on now is all flood deposit. It's all flood deposit. All of the ground in the ocean is brand new, straight out of the mantle, cooled basalt rock that came right after the flood. And that granite that's way the heck down there that we're all kind of concrete basemented on, that nobody really exactly knows how it got here, is what God spoke into existence. And we're never going to get granite to form like that in a lab because God made it. God made the granite, the flood made the sediment, and the oceans are currently making the basalt right now. And that's what your earth is made of. What's really cool, and what I'll talk to you about next time, is those rocks tell us an awful lot about how this flood went down. And I mean to tell you, when you start to hear about how this flood went down, it will blow your mind. Rain had very little to do with the disaster of this flood. Water only had a good amount to do with this flood. I am telling you, the cataclysmic events that were going on in the earth during the flood are mind-bending and mind-blowing, and the volcanism and erupting volcanoes and continents slamming around and moving and the entire earth being completely redrawn happened in the course of that flood to make all that life completely wipe out. And I am very excited to tell you about it, but I'm going to be very excited to tell you about it next week. Now, if you wish to have notes, because a lot of people asked for notes last time. In fact, I got to print extra copies of notes for some more folks who didn't get enough copies last time. The notes that I have already pre-printed have some of the stuff in them that we're going to talk about going forward, but I'm really pleased to say not really much of the good stuff. It's kind of the stuff I thought I would forget, and so I wanted to have kind of down where I could look at it. But I will give those to you, so you will see some things on the last about page and a half of the notes that I haven't covered yet, but that's because I wanted to be over-prepared for today. We actually got it about right where I wanted it to be, just ready for flood. So just to be really clear, before I close off for the night, my goal in tonight was to make sure that the ground was laid so that the flood that we're going to talk about next time makes perfect sense, and to just completely shatter any other idea that any of this could be anything but a flood. So we understand now, hopefully, that as we dig down in the ground, what we are finding is nothing but flood deposit, and that all of this hokey stuff that people have made up to explain what those layers are and how they got there must be garbage. And the reason why it must be garbage is because the sedimentary rock cannot be dated. The igneous rock, the ways we try to date it are bogus, and we know they're bogus because they're not repeatable, testable. They don't verify. Golly, there's been times when people have cracked open a coal seam and found a intact human tool or toy in the coal. Obviously, it doesn't take all that long to form. So we know all that rock layer is nonsense. We know that the age of the dinosaurs and the dinosaur fossils is nonsense because we're finding soft tissue in those bones, and that tells us it's not real old. And so all of that stuff just paves the way for us to understand, okay, if I'm just to wipe my slate clean, this idea that the earth is obviously billions of years old by looking at the rocks, no, that washes off. That can't be right. Does it prove that the Bible is right and that these rocks are exactly 4,000 years old because they're a flood deposit? No. But every other thing we see about these rocks lines up with a flood event perfectly. So there's no reason to doubt it. And the Bible tells us that's what happened. And so there's no reason for us to doubt it there either. Does that make sense? All right. I feel like I'm leaving you about half full tonight, but that's what I got. So next time when you come back, we're going to cover this flood in great detail, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And I'll throw a bunch of other cool little details and facts and science and stuff in there with it. Do I have any burning questions I can answer before we're done tonight? Oh, I got excited. I thought that was going to be an arm, Emily. I got excited. Yeah.
I read something the other day that said we're still producing oil.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. From dinosaurs, right.
Whatever. How are we now still producing oil?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So I'm going to answer that question, knowing we're kind of digging into next time just a little bit, but I don't mind because it's a cool question. So it's what it is like. God, as you guys know about God, he's so cool that when he does something terrible, he has something good in it. It's like, oh man, I'm going to have to do this terrible thing. But when I do it, it's going to fix a whole bunch of people. It's going to get a whole bunch of people saved. Oh, and while I'm at it, I'll just do this other thing that's going to benefit mankind. So when God wiped earth clean, I know it broke his heart to wipe all that life out that he had created. But he's like, here in a couple thousand years, they're going to need all this energy for all their machines and stuff. So I'll just go ahead and use this event to manufacture it for them. And so all of that life died and got compressed and did in fact become oil. It does not take millions of years to make oil. In fact, the guy that wrote the book that I read that a lot of this information come from used to be an oil guy. That's what he did. He drilled for an oil company. That was his job. And he said, here's the crazy thing, and you guys all know this. If you take an oil product of any kind and you keep it in your shed for a few years, it's going to lose its volatility. It's not going to be good anymore. Gas gets stale. It doesn't have the energy that it once had. Well, that's going to be true of crude oil as well. You will also probably know the BP oil spill that everybody just lost their ever-loving minds about is gone. It's clean. Where did it go? Bacteria ate it. Bacteria eat oil. Oil is not going to be potent if it's been there somewhere for 1,000,000 years. So there's a couple pieces of evidence. That oil must be pretty fresh. And if it really were hundreds of millions of years old, it shouldn't be here. It wouldn't be good, or it would be gone because something would have eaten it all. So yes, I think it's probably the case that we are making oil now. The problem is getting the organic material into a place where it can get made, but I absolutely guarantee there are places on earth where it is happening. Sure. And even to a degree, peat, which we can use peat in a lot of the same ways. You can burn peat for energy like you burn coal for energy. Peat is just coal that hasn't coaled yet. Like it's all compressed. It's just been not the right conditions to turn it into coal. So I absolutely believe that we are turning materials into oil right now. Absolutely we are. And rocks are forming right now. Some of those oil wells that they've drilled, they drilled some core samples. It was like 40 years ago or something. And when they got back in those to look at something, they're like, oh my goodness, all these rocks have started to form inside our hole that we drilled 40 years ago. Almost like rocks don't take millions of years to form. So rocks don't take millions of years to form. Oil doesn't take millions of years to form. If it did, it wouldn't be any good anyway. So, yep. Yes. Oh, yeah. It's called Carved in Stone, and I intended to bring it with me so I could show it to you. It's by the Institution for Creation Research, so ICR. I think the author's name is Clary, Tim Clary. But if you search ICR Carved in Stone, you will find it. I mentioned it to Kim Cochran, and she immediately bought a copy of it for the high school library, and I checked it out. So I would be happy to show it to you. And I would be happy for our church to buy a copy of it too, so that people can look at it, whatever. So yeah, Carved in Stone, great book. And all the notes I've taken, I read the whole book and I took notes on it, and you're welcome to have the notes that I've taken. I would be glad to give those to you. Any other questions? Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah, it probably was. Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, I don't want to, that'll be some stuff we talk about next time, but I do have, show you. Okay, so here's a great example of what you're talking about. So this guy said, just if you look at it from oil, because again, he's an oil guy. This is on the left, we have Brazil, and on the right, we have Africa. He said, when you dig oil up out of the ground, oil is chemically not all the same. You can kind of tell sort of what it was made from by the chemical structure of the oil. And he said, when you find oil on the coast of Brazil and you find oil on the coast of Africa, it is often chemically very similar or the same. So you can see here, all the little different shapes. So all the little red squares match up with the red squares on Africa. The yellow squares in Brazil match up with yellow squares in Africa, and so on and so forth, which leads ever more credibility to the idea that those were once together. So science, secular science, has this idea of Pangea, that the earth used to be one continent. They actually now, because every time we say there was a flood, and it flooded the whole earth. Like, that's ridiculous. They think that the earth flooded many, 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 many times. They will tell you, oh, see all this rock junk here? That's because one time there were glaciers, and then the glaciers melted. And then glaciers reformed and scraped by, and then they melted. And then glaciers came, and then they melted. And it's like, wouldn't it be easier to just like buy our story that one time all this stuff happened, and then that was just it, and it was just done? To to get it all to make sense, they have to keep doing this. And Pangea is the same way. Oh, it wasn't that the earth used to be one continent. The earth was a continent, and then it broke up, and then it turned into a continent, and then it broke up, and then it turned into a continent, and then it broke up, and I'm not making this up. This is what people think now. We think it is entirely reasonable that there was a continent, and it kind of makes sense when you think about Adam named all the animals. God gave him that job. Well, he had to see them all then. So yeah, one big continent. I can live with that. And the cataclysmic events of the flood were so cataclysmic that they totally redrew the planet. We'll talk about that next time. Yep. Yes. I'm digging this. Right. That's right. Fountains of the deep. You betcha. Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of study about that. And yeah, absolutely. There's superheated water is also part of what would have been in the crust during the flood event, which is what helps wipe out some of the sea life and, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, there is fresh water under the earth's crust. Yep, that's absolutely true. We're making fresh oil. We're making fresh water. All this cool stuff. It's really cool. It's almost like this planet is totally capable of taking care of itself, and we really don't have to worry about it all that much. And all this stuff that everybody's freaking out about. Man, they were freaking out about acid rain and chlorofluorocarbons in the ozone when I was a kid, and all of a sudden, none of those things matter anymore. We're worried about it getting hot. We'll be worried about it getting cold before long, I figure. Oh, man, global freezing. That's what we got to worry about now. It's climate change. It's just change, any kind of change. Have you noticed it's pretty humid lately? Climate change. It's cows. Cows are the problem. Cow farts. If we could just get these cows to quit farting. Here's the crazy thing. Cows were here before we were farming them. So that's curious. Oh, it's rice. Blame it on Asia. That sounds like a Trump job. That should have been earlier. Trump blaming rice production for it. It ain't the cows, it's the rice in them dadgum foreign countries that's the problem. Okay. Any other questions? Without totally blowing my next night. Okay, cool. We still made it to 20 minutes after. I swear I stopped 10 minutes ago. All right. I appreciate you guys so much. I'm going to pray really quick one more time because you can't talk to God too much, and then I'll let you go. Feel free to ask any more questions that you want to. I don't have anywhere I have to race away to be, and I do have copies of my notes if somebody wants them.